Our speaker, it's phenomenal. I've been excited about him for about the last 4 months. Heard him speak up at North Georgia, Jedwin Smith, and Jedwin was the, you probably that name sticks in your mind because he was the sports editor for the Atlanta Constitution. As much as that is a liberal piece of newspaper, the sports page I always read. He's outstanding, and he's got one hell of a story. I mean, this is phenomenal, and I'm glad we got a little extra time because this story talks about family, him going back to Nam, his brother. He wrote a book, and did you bring any books today? Okay, he bought his book, is My Brother's Keeper, right? And it's outstanding. I guarantee you after you hear this, this is going to bring some tears to your eyes, and he's just got a phenomenal story. He and I have just met, like I said, up in North Georgia, but I consider him a real friend, a close friend, because his story is just phenomenal. And Jedwin, why don't you come on up and let's give him a good introduction.
I'm retired now. I write books for the longest time since 1971 when I got out of the Marine Corps. I became a journalist. I covered the Bears, the Packers, Kansas City Chiefs, Miami Dolphins. I covered everything but World Series, Super Bowls. Got bored of sports, so I went and became a war correspondent. I was there in Beirut when all these troubles started, when they took down the BLT. Was in East Africa, helping fight the Soviets as a reporter. You're not supposed to do that, but I had no love for the Soviets, what they stood for. All that. But basically, in the back of my mind, I really lived for one thing. I'm married, I have 4 daughters, we have 11 grandchildren. What I lived for was to someday find the Vietnamese soldier who killed my brother, and I was going to kill him. They always say, you know, when you go after revenge, dig 2 graves, and I pretty much destroyed myself for much of my life in my late 20s and 30s. I became an alcoholic. I was psychotic. I always tell people, I was in the Marine Corps. I joined the Marine Corps in 1964, got out in 66. My brother Jeff was killed in the Tet Offensive at Mai Tai on 7 March 68. I tried to join the Marine Corps 3 other times after that. They refused my entry. And then in 1969, I always tell people, if you want to know how hard up the Marine Corps was for second lieutenants, is that they took me, they accepted me with open arms. They said, hey, we got just a place for you. But anyway, by the time I had orders cut, they pulled 3rd Marines out, and that was it. I'm the oldest of 6. We're a Marine Corps family. My dad was on Tarawa, Guadalcanal, Saipan. He was pretty messed up when he come home. All I ever wanted to do was be a Marine, and my brother Jeff, that's all he wanted to do was become a Marine. You know, you've kind of fast forward. In 1967, Jeff had hair down to his back, had his own band. He was in the original peace movement, you know, give peace a chance, protesting against the war. He was like one of those hippy-dippy weathermen, you know. He was just, you know, love you, brother, you know, all that stuff. And, you know, I thought he was kind of nuts. But then one day in early July, he showed up at the dinner table The hair was gone. He had a buzz cut, and he made the announcement that he'd joined the Marine Corps. You know, I thought, whoa. You know, it took me by surprise. He went through boot camp, ITR, and then 127 days later, Jeff was dead. Jeff's death destroyed our family. There's no doubt about that. The day the lieutenant colonel and staff sergeant showed up knocking on the door and informed my mother that her second son was dead, she divorced my dad on the spot that day. My mom, my sisters, they blamed my dad and I for Jeff's death. And subsequently we did not speak for 32 years. And while all that was going on, I was trying to find out exactly what happened to Jeff. Well, first of all, let me say, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm nervous, all right? Welcome home, brothers, all right? And I thank you. Anyway, like I said, all I lived for 32 years was find the guy. Well, really, I wanted to find the gook who killed my brother Jeff, and I was going to kill him. I'm not proud of that fact, but that's the truth. I wrote to the Commandant of the Marine Corps in Beirut. I interviewed every gunny sergeant on up, hoping to find somebody who was in Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, 3rd Marine Corps Division with my brother. The reason I was searching for was that the day Jeff died, all the Marine Corps told the family was he died of enemy action from rocket, mortar, or artillery round. That was it. He died in Quang Tri Province, which is like saying somebody died in Michigan. And that was it. There's no other information. Jeff wrote over 100 letters from Vietnam. Not once did he mention anybody by name. You know, he said, my best friend's from Ohio. My platoon sergeant's on his 3rd tour. He hates the crotch. That was it. So we just had a blank, just a complete blank. In 2000, I had just signed a contract to write Fatal Treasure, which is now about to be made into a movie. It's a story of Mel Fisher's 16-year quest to find the richest treasure galleon ever, and I was with him when he found it in 1985. I got a telephone call. It was from another of my brothers, Command Sergeant Major in the Army, Joe, and he said, are you sitting down? I said, yeah. And I said, I got something important to tell you, Joe. And he goes, no. He says, a little wait, I got something to tell you. He says, I just found on the internet Jeff's best friend from Nam, in whose arms he died. And I went into a 3-day spiral of, I really don't remember much of it. It was just like somebody shot me. Anyway, after I came out of that funk, you know, Joe and I are talking, and he said that Jim Arnold, Jeff's best friend, who lived in Massillon, Ohio, wanted to see me and talk to me. Like I say, I got 4 daughters, and I'm a newspaper man, which means I didn't make much money. So I'm thinking, how do I get to Massillon, Ohio, you know? And plus I got this contract to write this book, and you know, how am I going to juggle this and all that? And my wife came down to my writing room. She said, where's Jim live? And I said, Massillon. I said, and I had no idea where Massillon, Ohio was. And I said, where's that close to? And he says, it's right next to Akron. I said, oh. I said, Akron. Ohio. She says, cool. And she went upstairs, and next thing I'm still talking to Jim, and Jim's saying, we're trying to make arrangements that, in 3 weeks or a month, we'd get together and finally talk. And next thing I know is my wife came down, and there was a slip of paper, and this was like a Tuesday. She says, your flight leaves Friday evening for Akron, Ohio. You're going to be gone 3 days. And I said, Jim, I don't know about at your house. I said, but here, I'm nothing but a buck private. My wife is the commanding general. She says, I'm flying out to see you Friday. And he says, great, The thing about it is, what I eventually found out was, I had no animosity towards the Marine Corps for not telling us what happened. I mean, it's dead offensive, taking 1,000, 2,000 casualties a day. What I found out in hindsight was on 7 March, Fox Company had 7 KIAs. 5 days later, Lambswan East, the entire 1st platoon was killed. And then at the Battle of Dido, Fox Company was completely wiped out. There was 8 survivors, and that was it. They lost, the book is dedicated to the 66 fellow Marine and Navy corpsmen who died during Jeff's brief tour there in Nam. But I guess I had no animosity towards the Marine Corps. I understood, bureaucracy. Haven't been in the Marines myself. You all know about bureaucracy. You're all veterans. You all have to deal with the VA. So, but anyway, there were 8 survivors. I eventually, after I found the one, Jim Arnold, then I flew out to Eugene, Oregon, and I met Gunny Brandon. He's a Lakota Sioux, 6'5", 260 pounds, the biggest man I've ever seen in my life. Just massive shoulders. At one time, Gunny was 33 years old when he got to Nam. He thought the war was going to end before he could get there. And, he begged, he was a DI at the time. He just did everything to get over to Nam. He was there his first day and his thumb got blown off. They were going to, they said, that's it. So anyway, he ended up with 5 Purple Hearts. He kept signing waivers. But once upon a time, he had, I know it's going to be hard to believe a Marine would do this, but the entire globe and anchor on his chest. All right? Anyway, part of the anchor is now down on his thigh. He's got part of the rope on his butt. Right? What finally got him sent home from Vietnam was he is the only person the military knows of during the Vietnam War that survived a direct blast from a Chi-Com hellbox. All right, he lost an eye, lost a lung. His chest was just absolutely perforated. He lost his testicles. He was, well, as a matter of fact, he was declared dead on the battlefield. And then his captain was sent to Gray's registration just to confirm the body. And when he got there and unzipped the body bag, Gunny was still bleeding. And so he survived, Talked to him the other night. Right now he's battling cancer, bone cancer. But he wanted to let you know he's still kicking and fighting, and he ain't going to go down. He ain't going down without a fight. He's 81 years old. And like I say, the toughest guy I've ever met. But Gunny, the day my brother was killed, Gunny carried Jeff's body through a hail of gunfire. It was an ambush that the fight just continued for something like 7 hours. Carried Jeff's body through a hail of gunfire, was wounded. put him on a chopper. Chopper lifted off, and Gunny hadn't got out of the hatch yet, so he ended up being suspended by the hatch, not knowing what to do. You know, being a good Marine, he just let go. And he fell about 30 feet into a rice paddy and messed his back up, but not enough to shorten his tour over there. After I met Gunny Brandon, we got in a car and we drove up to the Canadian border, up through Washington, and met with Ken Fickle. And I guess, you know, I've given this talk so many times since the book's been published. Clint Eastwood's got it right now, thinking about the movie. It's been very, very successful, and I've pretty much always given the same talk. But this past Memorial Day, our 11 grandkids joined us in the parade in Decula. And they were just amazed at, you know, all the veterans, the flags and the uniforms. And, you know, Papa was a veteran. What's a veteran like, you know? And you're sitting there talking to a 9-year-old kid, you know, you're trying to say, well, in my case, I wanted to break things and shoot people, you know, so I joined the Marine Corps. But, so you don't say that, you know, and I try to tell him, so I told him basically about Ken Fickle. Ken Fickle was a Navy corpsman, all right? And Baby Doc, to all you grunts out there who've been in their company, but Ken did his tour of Vietnam, came home, got married, had 3 kids, and escaped to the woods of Minnesota, or Washington up there. He just wanted to be alone. He never ever talked about the war. His wife knew he'd been to Vietnam, but he just never talked about it, you know, being a corpsman. You know, a corpsman or a medic, the bravest of the brave, they see more than any of us ever will. Every horrible wound, every KIA, they have to live with that. Well, when I got there, you know, it's like driving, you know, just driving through the woods. Then we got on a dirt road, and, you know, I thought, my God, where are we going? And we finally got to this little house out there in the woods, and I greeted Ken, and he just came up to me and hugged me and just started crying. And I didn't know what to do because I was crying, you know. And he just started apologizing for being unable to save my brother's life. But Ken Fickle's story, you know, we had a bite to eat. Him and Gunny had a couple drinks. Then we went outside, and in the front yard, he had kitchen chairs and dining room chairs all set up in a semicircle. And the 4 kids, there's a chair for 4 kids, his wife, a brother-in-law, and his wife. None of these people had ever heard anything about Ken's story from Vietnam. And so, you know, he's sitting there, him and I are sitting there facing this half circle. And Ken starts telling the story of that day from his viewpoint. Is that he was back at Dong Ha watching a mail chopper helicopter being unloaded. And they got the word that Fox had run into an ambush and were pinned down. Helicopters and the casualties were inflicted. Helicopters started going off. And the radio just kept talking about casualty after casualty, and finally they couldn't get choppers into the air because the VC were firing rockets. It's 122 millimeters. He just went over and he commandeered that mail chopper, and pilot said was willing to go in. And on the way over, he heard that he said, "Smitty's been hit. Smitty's been hit." And he turned around and he said, "You know," he says, "of all the people over there," he says, "your brother is the only one we thought really shouldn't be here, because he was a hippie. You know, he'd be on patrol. You know, he'd just be diddy bopping along, you know, singing this little song. You know, Jeff was always the musician, you know." And he says, "It just drove everyone nuts, including the lieutenants." And he said, "But, you know," he says, "your brother, man, he just look at him and smile and just keep humming along." And he said he was a good Marine, but he kind of marched to his own different tune. He said, "I heard Smitty got hit." He says, "The pilot says I can't go through that. I can't go through the zone there." He says, "because of rocket fire." And Ken says, "Make a sweep." And now he says, "I'll jump out." And he did. He jumped from 40 feet, landed on his back, ended up breaking his back, crawled on his hands and knees to my brother, who by that time was dead, and tagged him, and then started crawling to other wounded Marines. But Ken turned around and he said, "What did the Marines tell you about the wounds?" And I said, "They didn't say anything." He said, "Well, do you want to know?" And I said, I wanted to know. I wanted to know. And I'd seen bodies before in Beirut and Africa, so. And he explained the wound. And he says, "It's my opinion that your brother died almost instantly." And he said the rocket, when it came in, that's what happened. It was hit by a rocket. Jeff was behind a mounded up grave with Jim Arnold. And now Jim Arnold picks up the story. And they were pinned down. They had their back on the grave, firing coming over their head. Jeff sitting there smoking a cigarette, you know. And Arnold sitting there firing away, and, you know, and Jeff just kept smoking a cigarette. And then because they went out in the early morning, they hadn't had breakfast, he just took a can of Sea Rats, diced fruit cocktail. And he's eating a fruit cocktail and passing to Jim and smoking a cigarette. Rocket came in on the reverse side of the mound. Took my brother off at the right leg. Jim Arnold also felt guilt that Jeff was God, that he couldn't save Jeff's life, because as soon as they got hit, he sent one of the guys from the fire team off to the left, and that normally was Jeff's job. But Jim, because Jeff was his best friend, kept him there behind the mounded up grave. And he said, you know, he kept saying, you know, when I saw him, he said that if only I'd sent Jeff off, you know, he would have lived, you know. And Jeff was a big fan of the Monkees. And while they're on board ship, he found a 45, a Daydream Believer on it. And he drove everyone nuts because he just kept playing that song over and over and over and over, you know. But on the 7th March of every year, Jim Arnold goes down in his basement and he has a jukebox. He hits a certain number, Daydream Believer comes on, he pops a beer, drinks a beer for Jeff's honor, and then he goes out and runs the flag up. Every year he does this. Another one of the guys that I found was Ron Dean. Ron Dean was Jeff's squad leader, and became Jeff's mentor, You know, it was his duty to keep Jeff alive. That's what he lived for. But then on 4 March, he went on R&R to Bangkok. And when he came back on the 15th of March, his entire fire team was dead. Jeff was dead. Jim Arnold was with Ken Watkins and Thomas Fleming of the fire team in the same fighting hole at Lambswan East when a RPG came in, killing them instantly and blowing out Jim's back. Ron, sat there. We had a reunion in Savannah, and he just lost it. And his wife has said he'd never seen him cry before, but he just lost it. He just buried it so deep. Another one of the survivors was Dave Leverone. And every year since I found these survivors, ever since 2000, we get together at Ron Dean's place in West Point, Virginia for a reunion. And when all 8 are in the room, they account for 18 Purple Hearts. Except for Dave Leverone. He's the only Marine radio operator that I've ever met that never got a scratch in Vietnam. Figure the odds on that. But that just ate away at him, He says, everybody else got wounded. He says, I'm always, he's just a little guy, but it bothered him. What also bothered him was he kept going to the regular 2-4 reunions, and he kept talking about the rock pile. That he was up there on outpost one night, and he keeps showing up the reunion saying, do you guys remember when those rock apes attacked us? And everyone would look at him like he was nuts, So the day I met him, I happened to have the letter Jeff sent from Nam talking about being attacked by rock apes, and how they were throwing stones at the apes, and the apes were throwing them back, And I'm sitting there, and I'm telling Ron Dean about this, and Dave Leverone, who I hadn't met at the time, he's sitting there, and he's just staring at me, And if you're ever at a group, and you see one standing there just staring at you, this guy there's going to be a fight. You just know there's going to be a fight. I kept looking at him. I thought, what did I do? I'm thinking, And what I found out later is my brother and I looked so much alike, he thought he was really losing it. He told me later, he said, man, I thought PTSD had just consumed me, and that was it. But I showed him the letter, and he just started laughing and going around to everyone reading. Hey, look, I wasn't nuts. We did get attacked by raw pigs, And, but anyway, what is a veteran? What is a veteran? They're guys like this. Every one of these survivors opened up their hearts to me and shed a lot of tears and talked about a war for the first time in their lives. I know that every one of their wives, when I left, from their various places, from whether it was Michigan or, Ohio or Oregon, the wives came up to me and gave me a hug and said, thank you for giving me my husband back. How do you respond to something like that? They finally dumped their demons so I could write a book, Anyway, the last of the survivors that I ran into was Jim Wainwright. He was just lieutenant. And he looked just like, you remember McHale's Navy? Ensign Palmer? He was a dead ringer for Ensign Palmer. And that's what Jeff called him, Yes, sir, Ensign Palmer, Drove Jim Wainwright nuts, And Jim was saying, when I found him in, he says, I wish I could tell you what happened to your brother, He says, but that day at Lambswan East, he says, we were taking casualties. He says, someone said, Smitty's been hit. He says, I'm on the ground. I turn around. I got shot right through the elbow. He said, and that was it for me. So he says, I never was able to find out exactly what happened to your brother. He says, I know you want to know, but I feel helpless. By that time, having talked to all the survivors, it might sound sacrilegious, but it was like Jeff had come back to life, all right? All the unknowns had been answered, except one. And so here I am talking with Jim Wainwright, and he's drinking moonshine on the front porch of Ron Dean's house there in West Point, Virginia. And he says, it bothers me, it really bothers me that you've got all these answers. And I, being Jeff's, commanding officer, I have nothing really to tell you other than he drove me nuts because he was a hippie. He was a good Marine, but he just kind of like, out there on patrol, just like diddy bop along, humming a song. And he says, it not like it gave us away to the gooks or anything. He said, but he says, I'm with trained killers here. And he said, your brother is just, doing his thing. And he goes, he says, I'd ask him what song he's humming. He says, he'd just look at me, give me a look like I'm the dumbest person on the face of the earth. He says, but whenever I gave the signal to charge ahead, he says, one of the first ones behind me was your brother. He said he was a good Marine. And he says, if you ever get a chance, he says, you need to go to Vietnam. He said, there's a gentleman over there named Duong Tuan. He says he was K-400 VC commander. He said he was the man that set the ambush that day at Mai Se Tai. And what Jim didn't know is the year before, Jim Arnold and Gunny Brandon and I went to Nam and walked the exact spot, the exact path that Fox took that day at Mai Se Tai. The man who took us back there was Mr. An. I had met him that morning. The only way to get back to Mai Se Tai, you had to go up a sampan up the Quavet River. And I was standing there, and Mr. An approached me. And next thing I know, Gunny Brandon, just stood by my side and just draped his arm around me. And it's like I'm paralyzed, And Mr. An, introduced himself through an interpreter. And I bowed, and I smiled. I didn't know what to say to him. This is the man who was responsible for my brother's death. That's why Gunny, I found out later, that's why Gunny came over and corralled me. He says, son, the last damn thing I need for you to do is start this stinking war all over again, So anyway, we get on the sampan, and we go up to Quavet. And got to Mai Se Tai, and I found the exact spot where my brother was killed. Gunny had the map. Actually, he still had the combat map. It was all bloody because the lieutenant he got it from had been shot through the throat. And Gunny saved his life, put his thumb in the hole, and carried him to an evac chopper, got him out, kept his .45 and kept the map. The map's all bloody. And so Gunny told me, on the flight over, he goes, don't worry, he says, I'll know the spot when I see it. He said, because there's a rice paddy. And in the middle of that rice paddy is a pagoda. I said, okay. And Gunny had a 7th grade education, but he's still the smartest Marine I've ever met, all right? But anyway, he says, there'll be a pagoda in that rice paddy. He says, over the left, he says, you got the Quavet River, and he says, there's one mounded up goot grave, and that's where Jeff was killed. I said, okay. So here we are. We're marching. We're on the same path. All of a sudden we get there and it's the rice paddy's gone. But out there are 2 pagodas. And over here where there's one mounted up grave, now there's 3. And, Gunny's sitting there, he's looking at the map and he's all confused and it's all, and Mr. Ron comes over. Through an interpreter, he says, what's the problem? And Gunny, as only the Gunny can, he says, well, he says, Smitty's brother here was killed by a gook over here in one of these damn gook graves, and I'm going, oh, here we go, Gunny's worried about me starting the war all over. But Mr. Ron just kind of backed away, now there's all the confusion, and he came over and gently took me by the arm and led me back to the graves. In perfect English, he went to this one grave and said, your brave American brother died here. And then I did not know how much anguish I had inside of me, how much hate, everything. I just fell to my knees and wailed, man. Mr. Ahn stood by my side the entire time. And when I had finally had no more tears left, he hugged me and said, our war's over. I understood what he meant, and I said, well, Mr. Ahn, if I'm not proud of this fact, but if I had met you a year before I'd met Jeff's friends, I would have killed you this morning at the mouth of Quavette. And he goes, I know that. He says, I saw it in your eyes. He said, but our war's over. And I pray that your children never know war and that my children never know war. Which takes me back to Jim Wainwright a year later on the front porch. He's sipping his moonshine. And he says, yeah, he says, there's a guy over there I wish you could meet, Mr. Ahn. He says, you want to know how small a world it is? He says, I was still in hospital with that wound through my elbow at the Battle of Dai-To. And he said, the Battle of Dai-To, which the entire 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines was literally wiped off the face of the earth because they took on a complete division, 320th NVA. But he said they cleared out the walking wounded, the cooks, clerks, anybody, and put us on APCs and drove us to the battlefield. And he says, I'm on the top of an APC with 6 other Marines. He says, and a rocket comes in and hits the APC next to him and doesn't explode. He said, next thing I know, another rocket comes in, hits our APC, and the other 6 Marines are killed. And he says, I'm badly wounded. He says, so I go back to Vietnam last year, he says, to visit the old haunts, and he says, and who takes me back to the old haunts but this guy named Mr. Ahn, commander of K-400. He said, we're sitting here talking about war, we're exchanging war stories. He says, and he says, Mr. Ahn says that at those 3 battles there around the Quavette campaign, he says he was at every one of them. He said, but he only fired 4 rockets during that entire campaign. He said he fired a rocket at an APC at Dai-To that didn't explode when it hit an APC. He said the 2nd rocket he fired, he says, I fired it at the APC and it blew up and everyone was killed. He says, can you believe that? He says, I'm sitting here with the guy talking with the gentleman who almost killed me. He said, and I tried to kill him, he tried to kill me, and he says, anyway, he says, Mr. Ahn said he fired a third rocket. He says, those things were so damn erratic. He says, it just took off. He said, he never knew where it went. And he says, and then he says, Mr. Ahn got real white. And Jim said, well, what about the fourth? What about the fourth rocket? He says, was it Mai Tai? He says, looked through his binoculars. Saw two Marines behind a mounted up grave smoking a cigarette. He fired the rocket. And he says he thought he killed them both. That is how strange war can be, right? I traveled halfway across the world to find the man who killed my brother so I could kill him, and instead I got a very big dose of maturity and compassion, and I'm glad I didn't kill him. I would have been killed anyway myself, you know. But that didn't matter at the time. I'd lived with revenge all those years. I came back and I wrote the book. It's been very successful. Everyone thought it was a war book. It's now used by the VA and the Wounded Warrior Program to help heal families. I talk with veterans and veterans groups, and because I have no qualms about telling everybody what a big idiot I am, all right, or was, they start talking, and there's healing. But anyway, that's my story, all right? I thank you for inviting me. I thank you for all the sacrifices you've made in your careers. And I salute you and I commend you for your courage. All right? Hoorah.
One thing that he didn't tell you, which was really neat, and it's going to be in the book, and I'm telling you, get the book. But when he came back at the Constitution, they were doing a cleansing, basically, of a lot of people. And he got called down to the conference room. And it was more, a lot of ladies had taken over, and probably good. I don't know if that's good for the Constitution or not. But they called him down to the conference room, and here he is with probably 5 different ladies. And basically, he was going to get his notice. And they said, Jedwin, I understand you were on vacation. Where'd you go? And he explained he was writing the book, or this is my side, I'll tell it like I see it. But he told them that he was writing a book about his brother. So he started telling the story. These 5 ladies started crying. After his story was over, they all hugged him. He didn't get fired. No. So I thought that was really, I really thought that was a neat story, but go ahead.
All right, very good. All right. Great story, great story, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
We hope you get a movie out of this. If they can do Unbroken, which parallels a little bit about your story, we hope that you really get one.
Thank you.
And you need to keep us informed as this thing progresses.
I will.
We do have a couple things for you, and which is one of our, we have actually our Vietnam Service Medal we've given to you here. It's actually engraved with our name on the back of it, which you can use for a number of things, including a paperweight or a fishing lure. Whichever one. And also, we're actually giving all our speakers a book now called AWOL. We hope that you being a great author, this might be something that you might like to read.
All
as
right,
well,
thank
too.
you.
So this is for you as
Well,
well.
thank
And
you.
Jedwin, we couldn't tell you so much for thanking and coming. You've been great.